Just to we did okay.
Yeah, what were we gonna say? I'll cut it
Just
this
saying.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, what are we like? What specifically is the topic of the day aside from the events of the last 48 hours?
You know that's crazy. I didn't tell you this because I
You
wanted
literally.
to. Yeah, yeah. Well, um, I'm more curious about your analysis, Fortissax.
Oh,
Fortissax. I don't know why I have this weird tick with people's names, but I kept calling you Fortinax instead of Sax.
I
I don't
remember
know.
that. No, it's all good.
Remember? Yeah, because I imagine you'd be
Yeah,
watching if you ever watch DA. It's like Fortinax says a really good. Like, Fortinax, what? Um,
yeah. No, I mean,
I
I think it sounds like Parthenax. Like if you played Skyrim, like
yeah.
Parthenax is and it's just Latin, Neo-Latin names, right? Like 40K stuff. So
There you go. Yeah. But so I was actually, I mean, eventually, of course, I think we will talk about the events of the last 48 hours, really the events of the last few months. But I was actually more curious about your own work and your own perspective and a lot of the historical analysis that you provide. So, anyways, I know it's terrible pretending there's an audience, but um, just so for the content minded listeners, I have brought on a special guest. I mean, all my guests are special, but this one in particular because I always promised, per the CBC mandate, that I would get more Canadian content, being a Leaf myself. But I mean, but maybe, well, that's debatable if I'm a Leaf actually, because we're going to get into this. So I brought on a special friend, a special guest, Fortissax. And so give us quickly, not quickly, I mean, you could go however you want, but give me your CV, give me your origin story, if you will, and how you landed on what I like to call the e-right, the online right. Because I don't know if you're an old head or a frog. I'm assuming maybe you came later. But yeah, go ahead, my friend. Go ahead with your origin story, and we will get into a number of contentious issues about Canadian history, about the current state of, you know, where Canada finds itself in the world. But I do promise my listeners, because most of my listeners are in America and Europe, that this will be very interesting in terms of from a world history perspective, because I think Canada is an incredibly interesting case study upon the world in terms of the history from the 18th, 19th, and 20th century onwards. So
absolutely.
there you go. So how did you get here, 46? How long have you been an alcoholic? Do you have your medal? What's your
So
favorite color? All that stuff. Yeah.
okay, so what's the last three digits of my credit card and my
Yeah.
social insurance number? So I've got a bit of a long story. I am actually an old head. I've been floating around under different pen names for a very long time, although I never engaged in content making. I engaged in the discourse. I didn't have a Twitter. I didn't have a Substack. I didn't write posts. I didn't make video essays or anything like this. But I have been around since about 2012, 2013-ish.
Oh man.
Yeah, so like I was on pole when I was like 16, and that was like 15 years ago, 14 years ago. Um, so starting from there, like for the Americans who don't know this, a lot of this wokeism, or what we would identify as wokeism, at the very least in Canada, has very deep roots, and it goes
Oh yeah.
back quite a long time. It goes back much further back than people think. And when I was still in high school, around 2009, 2008, they pulled us
Same. Yeah. Same. Yeah.
they, they pulled us out of class to watch the inauguration of Barack Obama. Now, keep in mind, this is the president of like a foreign country, and we had to take in this miraculous moment because it was the first Black president ever. Whoa, right?
Yeah.
So they pulled us out of class to do this. And my school also had one of the first LGBT safe spaces back in like 2010. It was a place where only the Rainbow Kids, could go and hang out. You weren't allowed to enter it. So my school experience going through the Canadian public school system in Montreal, which is a identitarian hotbed of conflict
Oh
in
yeah.
Canada, it's very unique this way. My school experience effectively made me start thinking along the lines of the right. Now, I already come from like a monarchist, one nation conservative kind of family. Like my family, there's like 2 generations of military servicemen. My grandfather was in the Royal Canadian Navy. My great grandfather was in the Royal Canadian Air Force. So very patriotic. I spent a lot of time growing up at the Legion around other veterans, mostly Canadian veterans, Commonwealth veterans, some Australians, New Zealanders, British, and when toasting during their meetings, they would say "God Save the King," and the songs that they would sing would be "God Save the King," and a lot of old Canada, a lot of the real sort of pre-1965 Canada. And so in this respect, my upbringing was a little bit different. For a lot of Americans in the audience, they think that the monarchism from a lot of these Canadian sort of neo-loyalists that you see on Twitter or other platforms, they think that this is a LARP. They think that this is a desire to be kangs and queens. But the reality is that Canada is still a constitutional monarchy, and Canada as a people, the Canadian people are the result of an epigenetic split between the Americans of the 13 colonies. 60,000 to 100,000 American loyalists left the 13 colonies after the Revolutionary War. They settled in New Brunswick, Ontario, and southern Quebec with the explicit purpose of rejecting the fundamentals of the American Revolution. They were against secularism. They were against constitutional republicanism. They were against liberty before the public or the common good. They were against free market capitalism and enterprise to the point where it could be predatory or exploitative. And that's actually partly why Canada didn't experience the Gilded Age, but we'll get into that.
Yeah.
So this is sort of my upbringing. My upbringing was already this kind of red Tory, one nation conservative milieu. And then, of course, I discovered Curtis Yarden at 16 years old.
Oh, there you go.
So that got me down the path of NRX.
It was either Yarvin or Julius Evola. I was more of an Evola head, so
I didn't mind. No, I didn't mind Evola too. I dabbled a bit into that, although I did find him hard to read sometimes. Like he's very a lot of the English translations are a little bit difficult to hack. And from there I discovered Radix Journal afterwards. I would read Mencius Moldbug. I discovered Radix Journal. That was NPI's old publisher in the United States. And through them, I discovered the European New Right, which is how I discovered archaeofuturism and Guillaume Fay, which is what I would say is probably the biggest influence on much of my politics and my views. So my upbringing... Sorry, go on.
No, well, I was going to say, like, I really liked archaeofuturism. I know that Fay, in recent years, he's sort of... the European New Right. We could get into because in Canada there is like that weird Ukrainian connection as well, and I don't know what your position is. I mean, I'm more even-handed when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, and so my position is it's a tragedy, and I desperately want it to end. But I know that a lot of the European New Right, not just with the Ukrainian war issue, but also in general, they've sort of had to. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them have sort of capitulated to a lot of like EU politics. We'll get into I cut you off, my good friend, so go ahead.
No, I was going to say...
I'm really curious to pick your brain on a lot of things. We're going to cover a lot of ground, hopefully. So, yeah.
So this was my political and familial origin, and then also going through the public school system, and also growing up as an Anglo-Quebecois in a primarily francophone province does things to you.
Man.
Yeah, so very few people know this. Like, I'm actually quite surprised that more Canadians don't know what an Anglo-Quebecer is. So Anglo-Quebecers or Anglo-Quebecois are the descendants of loyalists in southern Quebec in towns like Granby, Drummond, Sherbrooke, of whom they founded almost exclusively.
Oh yeah, especially Sherbrooke. Yeah.
Yes, who intermingled with Francophones. They lived a relatively peaceful coexistence with them for 200 years. Many of them intermarried. A lot of religious differences between Catholics and Protestants softened. And a lot of Anglo-Quebecers are actually both Anglo-Canadian and French-Canadian by blood. I would argue that they are their own sort of ethnicity in many ways. Not all Anglo-Quebecers have both French and English ancestry, but a great many of them do. And a great many of them are also bilingual. And this imbibing of the two solitudes gives them a unique perspective. And for a very long time, because Montreal was the beating heart of all Canada, it was the beating heart of Canada basically until the 50s, the cultural, political, and economic capital of the entire nation. The elite of Canada for that very long period were Anglo-French. And you even see this in the founders of the Northwest Company, who were competing with the Hudson Bay Company. All of the founders were Anglo-Scottish businessmen who intermarried with French-Canadian women. And so you see this intense Anglo-French convergence of the two solitudes in that old imperial capital of this Plantagenet empire in North America. And so Anglo-Quebecers, being a linguistic and ethnic minority, when they leave the province, they're French, and when they're in the province, they're les anglophones. They're tête carrée. They're squareheads. Tête carrée, retourner à l'Ontario. Go back to Ontario. Now, I had never. No, it's funny. Like I had never stepped foot in Ontario until I was 16 years old. Like I had never left my province until I was almost an adult, right? So, their numbers had steadily been dwindling by 1960, and by 1960, English-speaking ethnics from European diaspora, would overtake them in population numbers. Part of this is because, if you're an English speaker, you could just leave and go to find other economic opportunities elsewhere, the rest of Canada, in the United States. So they weren't as grounded, they weren't as rooted. And by 1977, René Lévesque passed Bill 101, which made French the sole official language of the province of Quebec, made it mandatory in all business, private dealings, the business community, industry, politics, so on and so forth. So this also led to basically a peaceful cleansing, so to speak, of a massive exodus of an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 Anglo-Quebecers from Montreal.
What the hairdo would call peaceful ethnic.
Exactly. So I mean, like that it gave them the benefit of prolonging and preserving their cultural, especially their majority, for probably 40 more years, but that would inevitably start to change with the mass migration into Canada. A lot of their goals were masked by linguistic chauvinism. What they were actually targeting was the demographics. And what's interesting now is that Quebec separatists have started believing their own BS. They've started believing that it's all about language and that anybody can become a Quebecer, right? So, but growing up as a linguistic and ethnic minority in Montreal, you're different from the English-speaking immigrants, and you're different from the Francophone majority. And so you're constantly reminded of who you are by all sides. It's almost like a knife's edge. It's like this catalyst for identity. Montreal's always been a hotbed of identity politics, uniquely so. And part of it also is because there's always been more of an integration or assimilation impetus in Quebec. Whereas in Toronto, by the time most of the immigration manifested, the cultural mosaic had already been adopted. And so there was no pressure for these disparate communities to integrate to Anglo-Canadian society. So that is essentially where I come from. I've noticed that, and other people have pointed this out to me, and I didn't notice until they pointed it out, but they say that your rootedness, your identity in Canada is very, very strong compared to a lot of people. For Quebecers, there is no question about what a Canadian is. We know what a Canadian is. And it doesn't matter if you're Anglo or French. If you're from Quebec, you know what a Canadian is, period, full stop. There's no debate. There's no, my family has lived in the same place for 400 years. I visited my ancestors' graves in the south of Quebec who were buried 300 years ago. There's a sense of permanence there. Jeffrey Amherst, when he took Montreal, went through the borough I was born in. There's just, and it's like I grew up 20 minutes away from a fort that an ancestor of mine manned like 300 years ago. So there's real living history in Eastern Canada, but especially in Montreal.
Well, I'm curious because when did the Anglo-French fusion happen? Was it more or less after a lot of the warfare between Britain and France had ceased with the end of Napoleon? Or was there some kind of, were there defectors beforehand that were interbreeding?
So from my understanding, there were trickles of British American colonists into the province of Quebec before the conquest in
Mhm.
1763. There's no recollection of them. It doesn't seem that they set up colonies. It's believed that they just intermarried with the local populace and sort of became French. The biggest wave came after 1763.
Oh,
But it,
okay.
yeah, but here's the thing: the Anglo population of Quebec never exceeded 10,000 at this period, whereas we're talking potentially hundreds of thousands to Ontario and New Brunswick, and that's
Yeah.
the key difference. Before, just a little bit before the waves, you have the Molsons. You have rich and wealthy families like the Molsons and the McGills,
Mhm.
profiting off of the war, moving into Montreal, bringing capital, bringing finance and industry. And so this would be the first trickle. And then it would eventually grow to 10,000. But they were never more than a tenth the size of the total population of Quebec, and yet they were the power holders. But they would inevitably form into the Chateau Clique. And people misunderstand the Chateau Clique was not majority, like even separatists, even sovereigntists to this day, they look back to the Lower Canada Rebellion, and they think that the Parti Patriote was an all French proletariat rebellion against an oppressive pure blood Anglo-British elite, but that's not actually what happened. It was an
Mm.
Anglo-French rebellion against an Anglo-French elite, because the Chateau Clique had already begun intermarrying with uh, French Canadian women. The Anglo-Scottish industrialists formed an alliance with the landowning seigneurs, the feudal landowning seigneurs in Quebec. People don't know this. Quebec actually had like feudalism, like actual
Yeah. Yeah.
medieval style land distribution, which is kind of neat. And we had lords, we had comtes, and we had marquises. We was kings.
Well, it
So,
was almost a latifundia system like you would find in Italy and Spain,
mm,
and well, Scotland had Scotland and Ireland had a very well, especially Ireland had a very complicated system. Well, that gets into like a whole bunch of other politics with the Anglos, but yeah, I mean there was a form of feudal, but which leads me to what we can discuss later about the sort of intellectual development of Quebec. But yeah,
yeah.
go ahead, yeah. Um,
So this is really the convergence you start to see as a slow trickle just before or during the war, as the Anglo-Scottish merchants were trying to profiteer from it, and then afterwards, when they became the power center in the city of Montreal. This is when, or shortly thereafter, you'd see McGill being built, the prestigious Anglo universities that defined Canada for generations.
mhm.
McGill would be built. John Molson ran a massive. He started Molson, many Molson owned companies. So they inevitably, not in a manner dissimilar from Swedish Vikings in the Kievan Rus, would start intermingling with the locals. Now
Mm.
they would never fully dilute themselves, but they would become Anglo-Quebecers. They would become Anglo-Quebecois, and I would say that these are different from English Ontarians in some ways.
Yeah, because there's always that persistent depiction that even comes out in meme form about Anglo colonialism being resistant to sort of interbreeding with locals. But I guess because there were sort of two European populations that had such an intertwining history, that in Canada you actually did have a sort of like weird fusion. Was it, I mean, like the stupid Cole meme about like, well, the Portuguese interbred with these beautiful native women, and the Anglos brought their wives, and well, I mean, you could argue the success of the Anglos relative to the Portuguese, but were the Anglo-French, were they outnumbered by, for example, other ethnic groups like the Métis? I mean, nowadays you have this huge debate over like Métis status and like the
Mhm.
percentages, but were they outnumbered by that sort of originary fusion between Indigenous Canadians and the French from Champlain onwards? Or was it that, so in other words, like they kept as a small sect within Quebec, but they
Mhm.
never achieved like a massive amount of numbers as opposed,
What's
yeah.
What's interesting is that, like, the Métis, from my understanding of history, the Métis are the result of rogue coureurs de bois and fur traders who went
Yes.
beyond the colonial boundaries. So uh, they were viewed for a long time by the authorities in the Catholic Church in the province as like licentious, kind of rowdy, not exactly good examples, even though they were peak masculine.
They went native in a way.
Like they traversed into the unknown. They'd be gone for 2.5 years at the earliest expedition. They'd bring home a cargo of furs that in today's currency is worth like $400,000. So they were making it rich. They were brave, adventurous dudes going off into the wild, doing crazy
The
things.
Faustian spirit,
Mm-hmm. So I would argue that the Métis are the consequence of French colonial trading policy, which was they would go to the indigenous and set up shop there, whereas the British would set up trading posts in nexuses or in sort of nuclei, and they'd let the indigenous come to them.
Yeah.
So the Métis were the result of the Coureurs de Bois and the fur traders going far out of colonial boundaries and establishing permanent settlements with the indigenous. But what's distinct and unique about French Canadians is that they did not also intermingle with the indigenous in a way very similar to Anglos did. And there's many people can pontificate or contemplate on that, why they can there's many different excuses, many reasons, the low population of the indigenous. My explanation for that is that French Canadians are ethnically more northerly than other French people, and they're slightly less culturally Latin than other French people. And part of this is because of the top 30 most common French Canadian last names in Quebec, 56% of them are Norman.
Oh, very interesting. So they didn't have that Mediterranean bent that you had, for example, in French Algeria or in Morocco in Tangiers, for instance.
And the second biggest demographic of French settlers came from Poitou, which is in northwestern France, and Angers, which is also around there. So you have Normans, you have Poitevins, you have Angevins, you have Bretons, and that's the other population group. So really, this majority Norman, largely northwestern French population that was very preoccupied with its own demographic survival within the United Colony of Canada, because they were concerned that with the massive waves of British settlements that they'd be reduced to a minority and then eventually assimilated. And to their credit, like, this was a policy for a while. The British elite, not understanding the complexities of the New World, did try to demographically and culturally wipe them out. It didn't succeed, and they gave up shortly thereafter. Many Quebec nationalists try to hang this over Anglo-Canada's head, but the reality is that they actually did just give up. They're like, we're not going to win this. They're already the majority in their province. We already secured their language rights, their rights to Catholicism, their freedom of association in Montreal, and that did happen with the Articles of Capitulation of Montreal. The British colonial government did grant them these protections, and then they solidified these protections with the Quebec Act, which actually pissed off the American colonists. That's part of the reasons for 1776, actually. People don't know that.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, but British because the American colonists fought this war. They fought the 7 Years' War in a North American theater, only for the French to maintain all of their land and property and territory, right? They wanted to expunge the French and keep that land. Of course, the British knew this was impossible. There's just too many of them. The colonial population was already 70,000. They had built 2 cities that were at that point 150 years old. Like it'd be like France conquering Belgium and then trying to displace all Belgian people after they've built up all of this infrastructure and have a massive population. So it just wasn't feasible. But also the British government was not physically capable of doing that. They were broke. They had just fought a war with France. They didn't want to inflame tensions with this new people that they now have to rule over. And so what you saw was a gentle and slow integration between the two solitudes. French Canadians for a long time have had this concept of pur laine or pur laine, which is like dyed in the wool. It's the French equivalent of old stock Canadian. So they've always been ethnocentric, and with that edge, with that demographic pressure, with the Catholic Church's adoption of La Revanche des Berceaux, or Revenge of the Cradles, they had 5 children per family for 230 years, just to so they entered that survival mindset, and they kept propagating with themselves and only themselves, with the off chance of Anglos, and those are really the only people that they intermingled with. So they're very similar to Anglo settlement patterns in that way. They're very uniquely similar to Anglo settlement patterns, because they're not just culturally but ethnically more closer to northern temperaments in Europe.
Well, that's fascinating that there's also a genetic history there, and how a lot of the more like Mediterraneanized sectors of France went elsewhere to more temperate climates, and also like the thing about like the expansion of Quebec and in terms of like women. I remember I had this comment once. Someone got really offended when I mentioned about certain like how the program of like they would go to Paris, the French government, they needed women in Quebec, and they would get certain ladies of the night to go to Canada. But then I remember someone got really funny. He's like, "No, that's a total lie by Mordecai
Mm-hmm.
Richelieu."
Yes,
And so was it a total lie invented by Mordecai Richelieu without naming? Well,
so there's a grain of, as always, the best propaganda is always like it has a
grain of
grain of
truth.
truth to it.
Yeah.
So most of the filles du roi were not ladies of the night. They were not outcasts. They were not degens. They were not any of these things. They were mostly orphans,
Oh
widows,
yes, yeah.
or they were just plain old young single women who, for whatever reason, basically they rounded up all the femcells and they shipped them to
Yeah.
they rounded up the femcells and they distributed state mandated GFs to all of the Quebec colonists.
They
And
would have
that's actually,
ceremonies where they would need the syrup candy. I remember learning this in school, but then at the time I didn't realize like, oh yeah, that is kind of like state mandated femcel
you're
GS.
talking about cabane à sucre, toffee.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
The
yeah.
toffee, yeah. Um, wow. See, it can happen again. It can happen again.
That's right.
But no,
We
but
can
it's
look. We can tell the British and the French, give us your femcells, and we need a baby boom. So
yeah, there's quite a bit of British femcells nowadays. I mean, if you go to Mumsnet, I mean, there's probably a few of them. I mean, but anyways, so without getting too vulgar, uh,
so yeah.
that's
Anyway, but my,
crazy.
my point is that they uniquely have a of the French peoples, for being a French peoples, they have a unique sense of ethnocentrism
Yes.
that is not seen as prominently in other French or Latin cultures like the Spanish, the Italians, the Portuguese.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, the Italians, well, we kept getting conquered all the time, so there was a lot of like interbreeding and like there's total like genetic drifts depending on where you are in Italy. Ditto with Spain and with Portugal. But it's interesting though because I remember when we talked before a millennial, you were bringing up this sort of resistance to American style liberalism in Canada. But I wonder from a Quebecois perspective, given the sort of relationship between the French Revolution and the American Revolution and sort of like the ideals of equality and fraternity, at least in terms of a political project, were French Enlightenment, and I know that, like, for example, in Anglophone Canada, like in America, you do have this sort of like Scottish and British Enlightenment ideals, at least somewhat. But was the French Revolution fundamental on the thinking of Quebecers, or was it that they were sort of like a loyalist colonial outpost
Mm-hmm.
holdout, and so they didn't really take to a lot of what was going on in France proper? Or were there sort of like, because I remember like my old man would be talking about when he was a kid and you had Pierre Trudeau, how he introduced a lot of French legal theory as opposed to the sort of British tradition. And people debate whether that was exactly true or not. So when the sort of like French Enlightenment, when the French thinking in terms of the revolution was happening, did it also sort of went across the pond to Quebec, or did they have a completely different mindset from their origins in France in terms of like,
So
intellectual development? Yeah.
So they did. As a matter of fact, they completely rejected the French Revolution, although not
Oh, yeah.
not immediately. You did have so you had Republican holdouts in the similar way that you have, like, the Lower Canada Rebellion was Quebecers. It was Quebecois and Anglo-Quebecois trying to throw off the oligarchy of the Chateau clique and establish a constitutional republic.
Hmm.
This was mainly inspired by the United States. And it's a very similar case with the Upper Canada Rebellion, which was considerably less popular. The thing is, once the Lower Canada Rebellion was put down, the reactionary tendencies of French Canadians immediately set in, and they
Mm.
begun to view themselves as the last bastion of the Bourbon Ancien regime. They viewed themselves as, in a way, not dissimilar from how Belarus views itself to Russia, which is that like Belarus literally means white Russia. They, for a long time, the Belarusian identity was like, we're the true Russians. We're the last of the last bastion of the true Russians. Quebec had a very similar mentality, especially with the theocratic Catholic Church consolidating control and power over the province. And many people don't know this, but like Quebec was a theocracy, at least until the 60s. It had direct governance over healthcare and education in the province. So if you wanted an education, if you wanted to learn how to read and write, guess what? You're going to a Catholic, you're going to a seminary. You're not going to a university, you're going to a seminary, right?
Yeah.
So it was a theocracy. And as a side note, this is why I push back on traditionalist Christians, reactionaries in North America. I'm like, we've actually already done this in Canada. We've already tried to return to the earth and find God and go back to Jesus and reject capital, finance, industry, and technology. And it actually resulted in a secular, nationalist, left-wing atheist society. So, there's some warning about that, and we've already charted this path before, at least in Canada. So, yeah, they were. I mean, they prominent French Canadian nationalists like Lionel Groulx, who was a priest. He wrote under a pen name. He was a Catholic priest, an abbé. He was an abbé. He wrote under a pen name. Lionel something. He submitted many of his nationalist writings to newspapers, to university competitions, and this consistent view that no, we're the true French, we're the last bastion of the true French, we're Catholic monarchists. And in this way, like, people think that the French were always against the British monarchy, but this is not actually true at all. That was one of the focal points that unified French Canadians and Anglo Canadians for all of our history. It was the reverence for the monarchy itself as a unifying body, as a unifying symbol, of course, fueled by their Christian temperaments. So they were reactionaries, and this union of Anglo and French was a union of two reactionary populations rejecting the American and French revolutions to the core. And those original reasons have been lost, as I posted about earlier today. But that primordial reactionary impulse is still there, which is why you see them viciously oppose not being American, even if their entire belief system is counterintuitive to their ongoing existence, right?
Well, that's so fascinating, because the sort of like narrative of America in particular, in terms of being a new land, like I even remember in his travel logs, if you read Baudrillard's book America, how everything is, there's a newness, and Europe is uniquely burdened by its own history, and everything is sort of, in a way, everything's a desert in the sense that everything's open and available. But at the same time, in the North, you have this incredible holdout of the old world, but not just the old world, as the old world itself becomes swayed by more, what would you say, modernist ideals. You have these reactionary holdouts in North America right next to the quote unquote new world of America itself being this nation that's uniquely ensconced in a rebellion or a charting of a different path for Faustian man. And so it's like very crazy. It's almost like a very schizophrenic relationship. But of course, nowadays, we don't really think of it that way, and average Canadians don't really think of it that way.
No, the average Canadian, only 1/3 of Canadians even know who John MacDonald is. So, like, they all know who George Washington is. They couldn't tell you who Sir John A is.
Oh my God, that's incredible. But
now, part of that's by design, though. In fairness to them.
We'll get to that, but also when it comes to the role of religion in Quebec. Now, I know that you would consider yourself a pagan or a vitalist. I mean, I myself am a Catholic, but I do understand, for example, what Ireland is going through or went through, let's say 10 years ago, very, very similar to the Silent Revolution, or was it Quiet or Silent Revolution in Quebec? I always get that confused.
Quiet.
But the Quiet Revolution, yeah, that you do have an incredible stranglehold of religiosity in Quebec. But then when you sort of shift the gears even a little bit, for some reason that system doesn't become very anti-fragile, right? So, I mean, I'm more when I was back in the Anorex days, when I was writing for Thermodynamic magazine, I was more of the sort of, I guess you could say, thrown an altar version, and then later, uh, reading Nick Land and all that stuff. But I do have a sort of romanticism for it, but at the same time, like as you were pointing out, there are hard limitations to any sort of like trad Christian revivalism, especially nowadays. And in Quebec, I mean, the conditions for that would be highly unlikely. But
That's right.
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's not like, so my own personal biases aside, the
mm-hmm.
the cultural reality is that Quebec is a post-Christian holdout on the North American continent in the European style. And I would say that applies to the rest of Canada as well, but in a slightly lesser context.
Mm-hmm.
So when I push back on the idea that nationalism in Canada has to be Christian, it's not necessarily out of, I don't like Christianity. It's more like this is not going to be culturally feasible in a post-Christian society. And in order to make it so, I believe personally, in order to Christianize Canada, and I won't say re-Christianize because that ship has long sailed, but in
Mm-hmm.
order to Christianize Canada, you have to approach it from the lens of someone who has never been converted before. You have to approach it from the lens of the priests venturing upon the Saxons, the pagan Saxons, and trying to establish a comparative study on their pre-existing beliefs. You have to forge links. Many people don't know this, but Charlemagne's invasion and the chopping down of the Irminsul among the Saxons actually sparked a 33-year war between the Franks and the Saxons. It was not a very good
Mm-hmm.
conversion tactic. In fact, it galvanized resistance. And the pattern with the Saxons is that they would revolt, they would lose, they would claim to convert to Christianity, they'd all be baptized, and then 2 years later they just revolt again and start slaughtering Franks.
Yeah.
So, but what actually succeeded in converting those fiercely pagan tribes was the unknown author of the Heliond, the Saxon Gospel, which reframed the Gospel, the story of Jesus Christ, as a war chief, as a tribal war chief venturing through the Black Forest. Instead of Jerusalem being a city in the Middle East, it was turned into a hill fort.
Mm.
And Jesus is depicted as this sort of tribal king, this Confederate tribal king, and this worked. It worked. Christianity spread like wildfire across northern Germany, and slowly but surely into Denmark and into Scandinavia. So, in my view, in order to Christianize Canada, the best way, if that's what you know Christians on the e-right or online right or distant right would want to do, is to
Mm-hmm.
take the post-Christian example. Take the post-Christian Christian example. Take the Europeans who were post-Christianized, who managed to find their way back to Christ, and then learn how to proselytize on those grounds in order to communicate with those post-Christians in North America. That's what I would do. Because as it stands, many of our guys, in my view, lack the epistemology. They lack the tools. They lack the
Mm-hmm.
ability to proselytize. Perhaps you might even say the education or the training in order how to do that. They're just, they're all saying, "Find God, Christ is King, Christ is Lord," but everyone's like, "Why? Who is that?" You know what I mean?
You have
It's
to be
not.
Catholic. It's a cat. I'm not casting shit. Oh, let's not. Might have to pay all that one.
No. But
Yeah.
it's not. And I wrote recently in my piece like how to engage the secular right, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe my points didn't land with some people. I think the most important thing for Christians to understand is that you're not talking to people who are necessarily, you're not talking to apostates. You're not
Right.
talking to people who were Christian and then dropped it. You're talking to people who have never been Christian,
Right.
because their tradition is secular liberalism. Their tradition is
Transnational
irreligiosity.
progressivism, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. But I would say that there are right-leaning currents of that as well that are mistaken. And although they may be rooted in the progressive movement and rooted in some currents of liberalism, it is a mistake to assume that all secularists are liberals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, well, a lot of it, I mean, let's be honest. I mean, both of us are millennials, right? I'm 32 years old. You don't have to dox your age if you don't want to, Fortissax, but
I'm
we're
about
like,
there.
yeah, we're both millennials, right? We're both soylenials. So I think like the society that we've grown up in, a lot of our understanding of the sort of like what is secularism, not even necessarily something very highly academic and baroque like Charles Taylor, but let's say like your average understanding of it is incredibly biased by things like, you know, the new fedora tipper movement and things of that nature. And I think like a lot of the picture that I mean, let's face it, most people that are quote unquote influencers on the dissident right, I mean, well, I should avoid that term, but like the online right, are millennials essentially. And
Mhm.
so we have this sort of like post new atheist view where secularism is either equated with some like weirdo in the middle libertarianism, or it's equated with the political left because of the developments in that particular movement with atheism plus, and then later,
Yes.
well, you know, post Gamergate. So, but like you were saying, in terms of a rightist politics, I mean, I know that, for example, BAP considers like originary right wing thought not grounded in, say, De Maistre, again, in Thermidorians and the sort of counter enlightenment, but
Mhm.
rather in this older secular tradition that you could even date back to the ancient world. Now, I personally think that there's room for both. I mean, but I understand what you mean by a secular right wing and how a lot of like religious trads don't necessarily have the tools to really engage in that, or vice versa. So
Exactly.
yeah.
And the other thing too is that it's not just Europe that has had right-wing secular identitarian or nationalist parties, but also
Mhm.
Quebec has.
Yeah.
Here in North America, we have subnational entities that have turned heritage or identity worship into a part of the state, or a part of a god, a patron deity in some ways. And
Mhm.
this is how I would say. So during the Quiet Revolution, when they very quickly de-Christianized on a level of what I would describe as some post-Soviet kind of country, they
Literally
totally,
post, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is literally post-Soviet. Um, Religion has absolutely no day-to-day effect or impact on everybody. They're sort of just very quiet. You might drive past a church, but you never see anyone in them or at them
Mhm.
or doing those things. It's viewed as a museum piece. It's viewed as like a mantelpiece, part of the heritage, but not necessarily defining in the modern context. And so they built, although most of the sovereigntist movement was led by leftists, secular leftists,
Mhm.
there were currents of it that were right leaning, and even the current reigning provincial party of Quebec is kind of this, the CAQ, or La CAQ, as people call it derogatorily. They call it La CAQ under what's his name, Legault, François Legault.
Yeah.
And so they built this authoritarian social democratic state. The state became the god, and then its patron deities became Quebec heritage.
Well,
And this
that
concept of a distinct society, all of their fundamental principles would be elevated to that status. They worship their heritage. Literally, they worship their heritage, which is not a bad. Obviously, it's not an ideal replacement, but it's not a bad replacement. It could be worse.
mm,
You could replace your god with a god of equity. You could replace your god with a
with Karl
transnational
Marx.
progressive left liberalism
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
fundamentally Gnostic, right, and believes in the cultural mosaic. So it could be worse. And but my point is that these movements do exist. They have existed.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go
yeah.
ahead for it. Yeah.
Oh, and
Go ahead.
and lastly, I would say that the French New Right is a prime example of this as well. The French New Right was tremendously successful throughout the 60s and the 70s, so much so that they had a massive, like Grèce was a massive think tank under Fayet, and until Fayet's departure with Alain de Benoit and their curious turn towards Eurasianism, sort of fourth political theory.
Yeah, and but now they've sort of come full circle. They really view, for example, Dugan as anathema. Now, I myself am not a Duganist. I think some of his Heideggerian scholarship's good, but I noticed that they have in recent years sort of gone down this like very weird path. Well, I mean, same with like, you know, Richard Spencer and Greg Johnson in North America. But what's very interesting is that you do like Quebec in a lot of ways is similar to the sort of like French ideological tapestry in the sense that you have people that are there's almost like schizophrenic engagement with political ideology. You have like legit fascist movements in Quebec alongside like more nationalistic forms of Marxism.
Yes.
But yeah, and like it's sort of like resistance to, like you were saying, like Anglo-style liberalism is a very key point.
It's very difficult to work with sometimes, because the Bloc Québécois, for all intents and purposes, as an advocate party for Quebecers, is anti-gun, it's pro-environmentalist, it's pro-feminist, it's pro-atheist, but they're the hardest on immigration in the entire country. You know what I mean? And it's just like, how do you square that circle? Like, how do you come to this conclusion, right? It's confusing even for me sometimes.
Open borders really is a pillar of transnational progressive ideology. I mean, it basically is a linchpin of a lot of things for a lot of different reasons. But the fact that they managed to reject that while still having the hallmarks of the other excesses of particularly Canadian current day liberalism, especially
now,
gun control and feminism.
There is an important caveat here that is very important to highlight, which is that even the Quebec nationalists and the sovereigntists they've been penetrated by the Anglo cancer that is manifesting across the entire Western world. So what you end up running into is, let's just say, NB Quebec sovereigntists who will talk about, who are like aggressively anti-Anglo, culturally, economically, philosophically, demographically, openly anti-Anglo, openly chauvinist, but then they all make land acknowledgements. They all bend the knee to that, and they apologize for their ruthless exploitation and colonialism and so on and so forth. So you're starting to see this cancer spread. When I was in Europe recently, I spent a lot of time in France, actually. And although most of the leftists there are an old style, more labor focused, more economic focused people, I happened upon a communist parade or communist rally, and most of the people there looked normal. They were wearing peacoats, the women were pretty, they had glasses, they had nice hair, they were sociable and normal. Many of them came from multi-generational families of communists. And so to speak, the biomass that you'd be so accustomed to seeing in North America associated with leftist politics simply did not exist. And if you did see them, they were the outlier, and they all share migrants. Or they're migrants, and they all share a unique characteristic. They're all fluent in English. Very fluent in English.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, it's the global culture industry, essentially. I mean, that like a lot of like, I know, like, people talk about the Frankfurt School. I mean, when I was in university, I mean, that was a huge linchpin of my grad school research. And I think that the sort of thesis of the culture industry being a uniquely North American spectacle that is imposed on the rest of the world, I mean, it's a pretty obvious thing. As much as I do have like reverence for America and I do have a lot of American friends, I do acknowledge that you see a lot of the same conceptual baggage that either was sort of mused upon in European universities and then really, really refined in America, going to the rest of the world. And how Canada has become this, I've said for years now, this like weird petri dish of transnational progressivism to sort of experiment on. And another thing too, I mean, because of our generation, we know this. It seems like both sides of the culture war have been tested out more or less in Canada. I mean, for example, with the alt-right days, I'm talking about pre-Gamergate, you have like, sort of like Sun Media, Rebel News. I mean, before that was the Western Standard. You have this sort of like model of the alt-right coal influencer that as relevant, like used as a pipeline into North America proper. And so it's like both sides of the culture war have had their experimentation here in Canada, which I think is like why it's so important to pay attention to Canadian politics.
But what happened there? And I have a theory on that.
Well, I mean, a lot of it was a total failure, but like
yes. No. This is important. This is actually really important.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Canada pumped out an obscene number of classical liberal or right-leaning liberal intellectuals, influencers, figures. You have Lauren Southern, you have the Petersons, you have Levant, you have
Gavin McInnes,
right? But what happened? They were far more successful in the US and in the English-speaking world, not in Canada. Why? Why were they more successful? Because Canadians at their core are not a liberal people.
Mm-hmm.
They're not a liberal people. They don't resonate with they might resonate with notions of further individual rights and freedoms, but they always stop short if they impact the common good, if it impacts public morality or the perception
Yeah.
or whatever the public morality is of the day. And I've written about this. Yes, we have the right to own guns. Caveat, there are a lot of restrictions. Yes, we have the liberal right to freedom of speech. Caveat, we have hate speech laws. Yes, what else is another example of this? Yes, we have free trade and
Yeah.
neoliberalism, but also our Liberal Party has been egregiously protectionist at many times in Canadian history.
Oh yeah,
Right?
yeah. From
Canadians cannot
Chrétien to Laurier to
Turner. Canadian
Turner. Yeah.
one of the best speeches against free speech. Free trade I've ever heard was John Turner ripping a new one out of Brian Mulroney. I posted that not too long ago. He's like, once a country yields its agriculture, once a country yields its industry, we will be reduced to a colony of the United States. And he's right. Like
He's right.
all of that happened. Like McDonald specifically had a mercantilist, protectionist economy for a long time, internal free trade, but heavily tariffed external trade.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what happened. So my point is that Canadians at their core are not a liberal people. The ideology might be left liberalism, but they are statist, authoritarian, conservative people. They're not fundamentally liberal people at their core. And so not only did right liberalism, classical liberalism ever really resonate with them, it's never going to. A Canadian identity, a Canadian patriotic sentiment has to be statist. It has to be collectivistic. It has to have a concern for the common good. It has to have a sense of noblesse oblige, this sense unique to British and French elites,
Mm-hmm.
pre-Enlightenment elites, of the elite taking the reins and forming part of an organic, harmonious hierarchy of which they are entrenched, and their primary occupation is the well-being of the people, of the middle and the lower, right?
That is a deeper interpretation of the sort of like ideological output of the sort of but along with that, you do have this sort of like global war on terror, GWAT, neoconservatism that took hold in Canada. Now, as much as I appreciate Conrad Black, for example, as a writer, I mean, when he owned Hollinger's and the National Post was gaining prominence in terms of like conservative media, then, Ezra Levant really took opportunities after this, the whole Human Rights Commission thing. You do have this weird like Americanization of Canadian rightist consciousness that a lot of like older boomers that, I mean, let's face it, they all watch Fox News. They all like really got charmed by Lauren Southern, and but then that sort of like doesn't go anywhere, and that sort of stifles the creation of a genuine right wing. No, but I would say that. Would you say that there's also more practical motivations, such as America having a bigger audience? Obviously, I mean, most of my audience is American.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously, like follow the
Yeah.
money. For our American
Right.
listeners, there's a reason why so many Canucks are anon, and it's because there are real world implications and consequences for speaking against the narrative, and all of us are hanging on by the skin of our teeth purely because of the Canadian state's inability to enforce speech laws.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. Yeah.
we are not free from persecution or prosecution by the government for the things that we say or the ideas that we talk about.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I like to think that there's something that Adam Wallace taught me many years ago about using intellectualism and obscurantism to your advantage. But I do think that as time goes on, there's a lot of issues you sort of can't avoid, even if you're like a face and a name. But you are correct.
Yeah.
Persecution is a reality, and I think that a lot of our enemies are state funded to the capacity that maybe they might not even be in America. Although state funding for activist leftist NGOs in America is a reality, and there is a deep state there. But in Canada, you do have like an explicit thing. There was something. Have you ever heard of Bill Marchant?
No, I don't think so.
It's crazy you haven't come across me. He was like one of the few NRX writers that came out of Canada. And actually, back when Terror House was publishing, I was part of the, he had 2 books. One was, 3 books actually. One was called Northern Reaction, which I think you can still buy. And the other two were Ending Bigly, The Many Fates of Donald Trump, where people were writing stories and essays about what Trumpism would.
Oh yeah, I remember Ending Bigly. I
And
didn't
then
know about
Ending
his other
Bigly,
stuff.
and then Ending Bigly A, which is about Trudeau, which I have an essay in as well. So Bill Marchant, I remember he had this. I think it's lost to the sands of time. This blog post in his Northern Reaction blog, but I remember he wrote this thing and it really opened my eyes, because I think my good friend T.A. Jackson, A.Y. Jackson, hopefully he comes back to Twitter, T.A. Jackson, because he was an old head that was post on my posting career. He linked me to this blog post by Bill Marchant, and I later befriended Bill, where he was saying about the state media institutions in Canada when it comes to the CBC and the National Film Board, the impulse of a lot of conservatives in Canada, and you see this even the rhetoric of someone like PP, where it's like, get rid of it, defund it, destroy it. Where it's like, no, that's a totally wrong approach, because if you actually look at the history of the CBC and particularly the National Film Board, you do have a lot of the. I remember like even watching this stuff as a kid with my old man, where you have like these documentaries about the founding of Canada. You have documentaries about in the 60s and 70s about the various industries. Sorry, like 40s, 50s, 60s about the various industries out west and so forth. You do have a lot of nationalistic content that could have only come about by a state media apparatus, whereas a sort of like free use American model couldn't really work in a nation of, significantly less population and huge landmass. The only communication a lot of people had was through state broadcasters. And so I think the wrong approach is to just completely gut them and destroy them, whereas in actuality, you could, make them more amenable to, for lack of a better term, like a based world ideology. I don't know. What do you think about that?
No, I agree with you completely.
Yeah.
And it's the reason why that has so much staying power is, again, because of the conservative temperament innately within the Canadian people. Limited government constitutionalism and the concept of limited government for its own sake has never appealed to Canadians. And this is because our founding right wingers, Sir John A. Macdonald and his conservatives, were big government conservatives. They founded the CPR. They founded innumerable crown corporations. For American listeners, this is state-owned corporations that are often privately managed. So there's a regionalist element to this, and I have to be very careful with the way I frame this, because many of my Western Canadian followers may take offense to pointing out some of the differences between the East and the West, but there are some profound cultural distinctions there. And namely that, for whatever reason, the Western provinces, specifically Alberta and Saskatchewan, have historically been more propositional than BC and the rest of the country. And to make matters worse, they did have not insignificant waves of American settlers from the American Midwest move into and settle the land in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And although they never became the demographic majority over the Anglo-Canadians in those provinces, their cultural strength has persisted, and their cultural strength eventually became more dominant.
The Calgary elite is essentially that Americanized. Yeah.
So
for those who don't know, the Conservative Party is run by what we would call the Calgary elite. Although, I mean, even in like Calgary and Edmonton, they still have like a lot of libtards like Nashi and.
So there's some context there, and that's because those two cities were founded by Anglo-Canadians, not Anglo-Americans. Interesting, eh? Yeah. So that happened. So they have an American streak to them. They have a more propositional, liberal, individualist streak to them, and this has constantly caused clashes with the rest of the country in terms of policy. And the modern Conservative Party of Canada rose out of a hostile takeover by reform of the PCs, which is not to say that the progressive Conservatives did not end up liberalizing. It's not to say that they didn't end up adopting much of the American and the British neocon right policies and talking points.
But Israel first and all that.
But that's more of a result of international pressure and global trends, and less of a homegrown paradigm shift. Whereas the Conservative Party of Canada was basically the bulk of reform taking over the progressive Conservatives, who were the direct descendant of John A. Macdonald's more statist, more authoritarian big government Conservatives. So the CPC, as many people would say, is more rooted in the Western provinces. They have that Reform Party sort of pseudo-American streak to them, and it has caused differentials, especially in terms of policy and popularity. It's not a coincidence that most of the populists of the PPC, like the highest polling ridings in Canada, where Bernier would have the highest chance of winning a seat, is in Western Canada, outside of Beauce, which was his home riding.
Well, yeah, exactly. And but also I wonder, I mean, I know this is more contemporary history. We'll get into a lot of other stuff, but what was your opinion at the time of Harper? I mean, in a way, he, as much as I think by virtue of comparing him to Trudeau, I mean, he's a breath of fresh air, but in a lot of ways, he did sort of Americanize the geopolitics of the Conservative Party. He crushed social conservatism, which is a huge linchpin of reform, and he really did create sort of what you would compare for American listeners would be like rhinos in America. And
exactly.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party of Canada is basically the worst aspects of the pre-Trump GOP without the social conservatism or even the religiosity. They're cowards. They're total they're total cowards with no vision for the country other than line go up and to the right, which is why they have been in lockstep with the Liberal Party of Canada. They love mass immigration, not because diversity, equity, and inclusivity is a good thing, but because it's good for business. They love their cheap foreign labor.
But also they're based too, apparently. They're natural conservatives. That's also another American, like Jeb Bush.
Yeah. Filipinos are natural conservatives.
It's funny because I remember watching, I promised my listeners I'd actually watch the whole thing, but I remember I was attempting to watch the Polyev interview with Jordan Peterson, and I was skipping across the because I guess Peterson's got a great editor. I was skipping across like the timestamps, and it was basically all just economic issues about taxes and like Green Line going up and the Canadian Wheat Board. And I'm like, does he talk about immigration or does he talk about any other social issue? And it's like, obviously not. So it's very funny, like, because I think that's why people have this conception of Canada being this bastion of the excesses of transnational progressive ideology. There was this documentary that I believe was actually produced by the National Film Board. This was, I believe, I want to say 2004 or 2006 after the gay marriage ruling. It was called Escape to Canada. And I might review it actually with Prude on DA. It was essentially about how...
I like Prude. Prude's a cool guy. He's a funny guy.
Yeah. But it was about like how Canada becomes this like weird bastion of liberalism. And I remember, for those listeners, those old heads of Digital Archipelago with me and Prude, if you remember the Kink review, the reason I brought this up is because in season 1 of Kink, there was this, no, sorry, it was season 2 of Kink. It was with Arsenault. There was this moment in Toronto Pride 2002 where you had this transition between the LGB, and then the T. The T took over in Canada way quicker. And it was at that moment in Toronto Pride 2002 when it happened, when they accepted the T of the LGB. And I'm like, that's fascinating. This is why I'm like, Prude, we have to watch the smut because this is like integral Canadian history.
We were also the first people to add the 2S.
Yeah, the Twin Spirit and the yeah.
So there's something. Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't actually know that. I didn't know that we adopted the T far earlier than the Americans did.
You mean to tell me that after Trailer Park Boys and Kenny versus Spenny, you didn't stay up at night to watch Kink on Showcase?
No. Oh man, Showcase. That's taking me back here.
Yeah.
For those of you guys who don't know, Showcase is basically like
it's like our Cinemax, yeah.
No, I would say it's more like our what was the company that made Game of Thrones?
HBO.
Yeah, it's like Canadian HBO. It's like all the edgy sort of late night programs with like cynical, gritty shows and characters, and a lot of it was obviously not as cool or not as edgy as what would come out of HBO. Like, unfortunately, Showcase never produced anything as good as season 1 of Rome. That's one of my favorite shows. But it was for, in the Canadian context, it was basically like that. It was like this like late night HBO-esque kind of thing.
Yeah, this is the origins of Trailer Park Boys, and also I believe you can watch every Kenny versus Benny episode for free on YouTube. So there you go.
To touch on the left liberalism, and this is what I would say. So there's two waves that I've noticed when it comes to this transnational progressive thing. The first is that what I'll call Trudeau liberalism, coming from Lester Pearson, coming from people like Will Kimlicka, Nanette Kelly, Michael Treblekoff.
Kimlicka is a huge, even Paul
Kimlicka, Kimlicka is like the master brain. He's one of the huge, most influential intellectuals for this for this entire belief system. I believe, as I was responding to Captive Dreamer earlier today, because he said after the British Empire fell, Canadians were unmoored from their traditional sense of identity. It became purely negative. The paradoxical effect is that they become, in a sense, turbo blue state Americans, leftists on steroids. Yeah. Right. Now, he also said that Canadians read New York Times' op-eds and take them at face value. So there's something. No, he's right, but there's something going on here. And the greater thing, in my theory, is this is rooted in the split between the Loyalists and the Patriots. This is Canada's primordial reactionary instinct reacting to the right-leaning liberalism of the US. So it developed left liberalism. It developed Trudeau liberalism. And then over time, as you said, as those European ideas from the 60s would make their way to the US and then calcify and then churn out to the rest of the world.
The Berkeley consensus, as people would call it,
Yeah, exactly. And all of the cultural Marxist schools operating out of the US, schools of thought, I mean, you'd see this slowly converge with Canadian liberalism.
Yeah.
So, but the point is that this is once again Canadians' inability to escape their origins. This is Canadian libtardism is a reaction to the United States. It's rooted, and they don't remember the how and the why, but it's the instinct is there, and that's why the entirety of the Canadian left right now is reacting so insanely to the Trump tariffs. It's why, despite the fact that they've built a post-national economic zone that is supposedly an illegitimate state built on stolen Indigenous land, it's why they can schizophrenically simultaneously be patriots, right? Because and that's what's going on here.
No, 100%, and it's everywhere. Like I remember even back in the day, if you I forget the timestamp, but if you were to watch the wrestling documentary Bret Hart Wrestling with Shadows, there was this promo he cut back in, I believe it was MSG. This was 1988, and Canada was a much different place back then. It was actually, you were actually excited to go to Toronto when you were a kid. And he had this promo about, like, in Canada, because of course he was a heel in America, he was a face in Canada. In Canada, we take care of each other. We have healthcare. We don't have guns and racism. It's like all the Americans like, woo. But it really did strike a chord of like the sort of like negative identity of current day Canada. And now that
are you talking about the Molson Canadian commercial?
No, I'm talking about this Bret Hart promo.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He said, we don't have guns and racism, and we have crime. But then he also said, we don't have crime on the streets, and our cities are cleaner, and we care about each other. So it was like this weird mix of social conservatism with the excesses of like left liberal ideology.
Yes,
which totally
that is Canadian liberalism. That is what happens when reactionary traditionalists turn into libtards. Like that is, you see a similar phenomenon in Germany. They're some of the most hardcore supporters of global left liberalism, and that's because why? Well, you know why.
Yeah, right? We don't have to get into it. Yeah.
Who else were they hardcore supporters of not too long ago, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But and that's the thing. I think you do have this like weird ideological fog. Well, I guess we'll get into later about the current situation. It's not really treason to like point out the failures of Justin Trudeau and also the sort of like tone deafness of Canadian boomers in particular, and how they can sort of have this very, like you were saying, modest, conservative approaching lifestyle while also supporting the absolute erosion of Canada. and how you will have this sort of like more of an American or globalized style liberalism as you do have this massive demographic shift in Canada. So no longer do you have clean cities along with functioning healthcare. Now you have very dirty cities with very terrible healthcare. And so what would that look like? I mean, in your estimation, what are the severe consequences of having a more globalized rather than a uniquely Canadian form of left liberalism?
So I wrote about this in an article that popped off almost with the same amount of views as my very first one, which on Substack, which made it to like the top 4 in the culture section of that website when I launched it. It's one of my crowning achievements.
Oh yeah.
So when I wrote A Fighting Chance, which is I didn't intend it for it to be this long, but it's a 14,000 word essay on why it would be a bad idea for Canada to join the States. And if you look at the demographic realities of the United States, and you look at the age-related demographics of the U.S. and their philosophical liberalism, not only is acting as a roadblock to their identification as a nation. And I will never tear down Orrin McIntyre or Charles Haywood or any of these guys who are saying America is not an idea, it's a nation. The problem with that is Americans of the European extraction do not have a cohesive ethnic identity from coast to coast. They're actually more like multiple diasporas. They're far more individualized. They're far more fractured in this way. Canada doesn't have this problem. And if the ethnos drives the ethos, and that was the presupposition that I was basing my views on. If the ethnos drives the ethos, then there's no reason to assume that the U.S. is going to be able to assimilate the massive quantity of foreigners in their country. Statistically speaking, the biggest supporters of the GOP and of Trump are European Americans. The biggest supporters of the First and Second Amendment are European Americans. So, on a cultural basis, in order to fix their country, they have to abandon many of their foundational liberal principles. And I know Paul Fahrenheit swung at me, and after the show, we had a few words towards each other, and he educated me a little bit more on the foundation of the United States. And it's true, it's 100% true that the U.S. was not purely founded on Enlightenment ideals of John Locke. It's true that John Locke was one of the minority voices, but the broader angle I was taking was that their foundation is liberal. Their foundation is rooted in liberalism of the New World. It's rooted in that severing of old world ideas. And so, would I say that America has always been a nation of ideas? No. Would I say that they kind of lean in that direction for much of their history? Absolutely. Look at the 1790 Naturalization Act. Look at A Country for Free You-Know-What Men, and then the 1860s with the massive, massive waves of European migration that ended up displacing many of the founding stock. The founding stock who were only the majority in Utah and Upper New England and a handful of other places. The fundamental ethos of the United States began to change. If you start from the first principle that all men are created equal, regardless of how many caveats you have to that and amendments, you're going to snowball into the entire world. You're going to snowball into everybody. Everybody can be American. America is a nation of ideas, right? So the dissolution of the Canadian state into the dynamo, into the beating heart of neoliberal, whether it's right or left neoliberalism, is the dissolution of the Canadian people.
Right.
If ethnos drives ethos and we get absorbed into that, it's over. You're looking at the extinction of an entire people. You're looking at the disappearance of a people with their own folkways, with their own culture. So it's
go ahead.
I was just going to say there's aside from maybe on an individual level, being able to enjoy a lower cost of living, a slightly better labor market for job opportunities, the trade-offs are not actually that strong. We're exposing ourselves to a country whose majority population is going to be minority in 5 years, most of whom are old, and that's the other benefit. Not only will Canada be more homogenous, but it will have more young people. We have more Generation X, millennials, and Zoomers than we have boomers. So
It just so happens the boomers happen to have immense political power and cultural power, unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah. But you're seeing the proposal of like Canada becoming the 51st state, you mean? That to me, that's nonsense, in my opinion.
No, I also believe it's nonsense, right? But this was more
a North American Union situation, you mean?
Yes, but even then, if there is, okay, I don't believe that we're going to be annexed for a number of reasons.
Right.
This piece was more directed towards the Canadians who were seriously regarding it. Many of them prominent voices. There are a lot of pro-annexation shills on X. A lot of these people are rootless populists. It's very unfortunate that when polled, half the PPC was in favor of joining the United States.
Yeah. And just to put this out there, myself, I have a great reverence and respect for a lot of things about America, but I myself am not. I mean, I don't subscribe to that view of like, well, we're better off if we're just America light. Like, I think that's Although in the past I was way more black-pilled about Canada, and I will admit, like, you know what I mean?
Part of my project,
totally.
absolutely. Part of my project is to try and provide some white pills, because I know how easy it is to get black pilled. I know how frustrating it is to live in Canada. I mean, even the left's LARPing as patriots right now is extremely frustrating.
Incredible frustrating, yeah.
But so there's that, and then when you get to the First and Second Amendment, it's not just that their majority are the only ones, or mostly the people who support it, but also like our restrictions on firearms ownership are actually not as bad as people think they are, mainly because Canada has the 7th highest population of firearms owners on the planet. Right. We're already relatively armed to the teeth for how small our population is. And the same deal for speech. The Canadian state is not logistically capable of limiting firearms ownership or really enforcing hate speech laws.
Well, it's not like the British. It's not like we're not getting thrown in jail. There are people that like they come the hammer down on them. But I do still think, and it's painful to me because I have a lot of friends in the UK. It's very painful to me, but I do see that, like, despite the lawfare against Jeremy or Lynch, what's her first name again?
Tamara
Lynch. And as much as a lot of these activists hound them and basically, clock their every single move, man, I might have to pay all this for you. But like, I think that like it's bad relative to American First Amendment.
Yes.
But it's not as like,
as Morgoth would say, we're not the North Korea of woke, which is what the UK is turning into. The UK is like very quickly turning into like an isolationist woke state.
Yeah. And then people like
nowhere near that bad.
Exactly. And then people like accuse others of being feds and all that crap. Like, that's nonsense to me. Like, even organizations in America, which I won't name, I think like the Fed jacket people is nonsense. And I think like, because like to me, like the fact that there is like a lot of attention on the very specifically few like post convoy protesters, it's like I've lurked a lot of these left-wing activists in Canada for a long time now. They have like this like crazy schizophrenia when it comes to like, there's this dark American money funding the right wing. Like, I would love to be cut a check, but not to listen. I'm not saying.
Well, no. Okay,
that,
so
like,
it's but it's what, again, the best propaganda has a kernel of truth. An estimated 1/3 of convoy donations were from American private citizens and possibly politicians. Yeah. So. But to suggest that it wasn't wholly a homegrown Canadian thing is absolute nonsense. It was extremely Canadian.
I think a lot of it's just an organic. Like, see, this is what the political left doesn't understand, is that because you have to have a conspiratorial narrative that sounds very scary to justify your political, ideological, or even financial ends, I think that they discount the fact that a lot of it was organic in the sense that people on the political right in Canada that are influencers, we have friends in America. Obviously, like Tucker Carlson, for example, seeing the trucker protest, our good friend Gord went on Tucker Carlson. Like, a lot of it, I think, is organic to the extent that people are seeing a sort of brother nation going through a uniquely hateable libtard government. Now, is there people that want to like sway Canadian politics towards a more American conservative consensus? Yeah, of course. And that should be resisted. But I think that like a lot of these things is just more of like, it's sort of like when Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux were like touring in America and Australia. Like, I had this essay I wanted to write. I think I'll publish it one day. called, again, another wrestling term, the Culture War Outlaw Mud Show. Because I remember
I like that. That's funny.
Yeah. I remember watching that Lauren Southern documentary, and listen, as much as I do not particularly like Lauren Southern, I think like it was a good catalog of what was actually happening pre-Gamergate. A lot of these people didn't know what the hell they were doing. And so they would like go to these lectures and they would tour, and it was a very new phenomenon. And they suffered for it. I will say they suffered for it, especially Stefan Molyneux.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, but it was like very weird how it was like the 2000s and no one knew what they were doing, and there was this like weird air of optimism. Then Gamergate came down the pipeline, and there was a lot of Canadians involved in that. And it's like, that's why I called it the Culture War Outlaw Mud Show, because I think there was an organic attempt, however convoluted, however filtered through American ideology it was, there was still like something there. And of course, Lauren Southern becoming a backstabber and a traitor, that's a different story. But I think there was something there. And then later it extended to the trucker protest. And that was, as I wrote in that article, Ending Biglier, there was a weird form of protest that I compared. I know this sounds crazy, and it's not to be Fed posty, by the way. I compared it to Foucault's writings in the French, not the French Revolution, on the Iranian Revolution, which was a mass populist protest that was embedded in daily life, in daily economic activity, that had a sentiment that was unique from, let's say, the French Revolution tradition of protest in America and elsewhere. Yeah, go ahead, Fortissax.
I was going to say, like, absolutely. And like people, Americans especially, they may have had it tough, especially in blue states. But what they don't know is that 8 million people in this country were prohibited, out of 35 or 37 million, were prohibited from boarding a plane, a train, a coach bus, or a ship of any kind. Yes. They were prohibited from crossing into the US, and they were prohibited from going elsewhere to a place like Europe or South America, while simultaneously being blamed for spreading. And some cities had restrictions or travel advisories against leaving your city. So if you didn't own a personal vehicle, you were basically screwed, and you'd be, the only way you'd be able to travel is through Canada. You would not be able to leave, while simultaneously being framed as a plague rat, as a literal threat to everyone's grandmother and their entire family, right? So there was a huge organic pressure from the ground up, rooted in the economic life of Canadians, and to the point where they showed up in the coldest month of the year to protest against the federal government. Mm-hmm. Which say what you will, academic agent says that elite theory is prime, populism is a delusion. There's a lot of truth to that. Yeah. But what is true is that populist revolt did end all of the lockdowns, all of them, on a federal and a provincial level, very shortly after, a couple of months after.
Oh yeah, exactly. And what people didn't know, I know this because my GF lives in the States. Biden actually had longer travel restrictions on the US-Canada border than Canadians. Like if you were Canadian, I believe around the earliest of 2023, you could fly, you could go to Europe or South America, wherever, but you still couldn't go to America if you didn't have the
That's right.
procedure. Yeah. And so I couldn't see my GF for a long time. And yeah, I mean, I was one of them. I refused to I had the thing twice. I had mild cases both times, despite my weight or whatever.
I lost a job because of COVID. I actually
really?
Yeah, I lost a job, and then I lost multiple opportunities because I refused.
Incredible. Like, you don't have to dox yourself, but could you say a little bit about what happened with your job, or is it too?
It's nothing special. It was either like, you have to get the voter to remain working at this workplace. I said, no, I'm not doing that. It's not even legally enforceable to force me to do that. And they said, well, in regards to safety of so-and-so, you can't be doing that. I'm like, okay, well, goodbye.
Man, that's crazy. Yeah, like the people in the Canadian military and even the American military, which is another thing. I guess we could transition to that, because that's another thing that you talk about a lot. I was reading a thread of yours recently about the sort of anglicized liberalism of Canada, and in terms of Pierre Trudeau, a huge linchpin was gutting the Canadian military.
He destroyed it.
When the Canadian military had outperformed a lot of people during World War II and World War
Yes.
One. But yeah, go ahead with the history of the Canadian military in particular. I'm very fascinated by this.
Canada, like a great many other things that we do, we might be small, and we were never more than a middle power. We were always an economic, military, diplomatic middle power.
Yes.
We were never a superpower. We might not even have been a global power, but we were a middle power. We were a secondary power. And in the First and Second World War, Canada had one of the largest volunteer armies. I'm talking like 1 million or 2 million people or something like that. And in those wars, and also in the Boer Wars, they would do crazy things. Like in World War II, they would spike cans of food and throw them at starving Germans, and the cans would be spiked with grenades. We attacked the Germans during the Christmas truce in World War I. Like, we have a very bloodthirsty military history that very few people are aware of, and we always punched way above our weight in military endeavors. After World War II, Canada had, I think, depending on who you ask, we either had the 4th or the 6th largest navy on the planet. We had 2 aircraft carriers at one point, and we did have the technical expertise and the professionalism to build a nuclear weapons program, but we decided not to. We decided to invest in civilian power reactors. The CANDU reactor today is still one of the most advanced nuclear reactors on the planet.
Yes.
So, and then of course there was the Avro era. Depending on who you ask, there are many different reasons why it was canceled. Part of it was taking up 25% of the entire Canadian military budget. Some say the Americans threatened the government because they wouldn't tolerate an implied threat on their border, which is possible. The Avro Arrow was the most advanced bomber interceptor in the world at the time. It was a supersonic bomber interceptor, if I'm recalling correctly.
Yes.
Now, the other issue, of course, was that ICBMs were technologically more advanced, and there was no longer a need to intercept planes that would drop bombs. So that's the other thing. Although it did jettison like 6,000 aerospace engineers, most of whom, the canceling of the project, most of whom would end up working for the U.S. Air Force. Yep. So if I want to get into my lib Canadian pride, I'd say U.S. Air Force is a result of Canadian supremacy. But so we have a very long, also in World War II, we wrote the manual at the time for house-to-house urban combat. Like, Canadians were exceptional in urban warfare, like exceptional.
We're the first tunnel rats, yes.
Yes, we invented the technique of blowing holes through walls in order to avoid firefights in the empty and open streets. So our fighting capacity is insane. It's always been insane, especially for how small the population is relative to other countries and their levels of volunteers. But in the 70s, Pierre Trudeau, by exploiting the reactionary tendencies, and maybe even unbeknownst to him, maybe he wasn't even aware of this. I think he might have been, but maybe he wasn't even aware. But he exploited this New York Times perception of America as this like militaristic expeditionary force that goes around world policing, and we use this term world police a lot. Canadian leftist patriots use this term. Well, we're peacekeepers, not policers. We don't believe in that. And so part of that was, he exploits the reactionary impulse in Canadians. We're like, oh, what's the way to not be American? Have no military. So we have no fighting capabilities whatsoever. So we destroyed centuries of military tradition in the Royal Canadian Armed Forces, the Royal Canadian Navy and Air Force and the Canadian Army, and we merged them into a single small cohesive unit. We deprived all of these different branches of their traditional uniforms, their customs, and that's the beginning. And then we failed consistently to not meet our bare minimum NATO obligations of 2% GDP being focused into the military.
Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantairproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every content-minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.